Tonight, we begin a journey through the story of England, not as a lecture, not as a list of kings and battles and dates to memorize, but as the story of a small island that, over thousands of years, slowly transformed itself into one of the most influential places the world has ever known. England is, at first glance, an unlikely centre of history. A narrow stretch of green land resting off the western coast of Europe, wrapped in fog, rain, forests and cold seas. If you stood above it from the sky centuries ago, you might never imagine that this island would one day shape languages, governments, trade, science, industry and culture across the globe. And yet it did. The story begins long before the word England ever existed, before castles, before London, before crowns, parliaments or empires. Thousands of years ago, this land was wild. Dense forests covered much of the countryside. Wolves moved through the trees. Rivers cut slowly through untouched valleys, and small human communities survived along the edges of woods and coastlines, adapting to harsh winters and uncertain harvests. Over time, different peoples arrived. Ancient tribes settled the land. The Celts built communities and traditions that would leave lasting marks across Britain. Then came the Romans, crossing the sea with organized armies, roads, walls, and cities. For centuries, England became part of one of the greatest empires in history. But empires never last forever. After Rome withdrew, new waves of settlers arrived from across northern Europe: Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Kingdoms rose and fell. Wars reshaped the island again and again. Gradually, the foundations of what would become England began to emerge. And this was only the beginning. Because the history of England is not a straight line. It is a story of invasions and survival, of monarchs and rebellions, of plague, expansion, industry, revolution, and enormous change. A story shaped as much by ordinary people as by famous rulers. In the centuries ahead, this small island would produce Shakespeare and Newton, survive civil wars, build the largest navy on earth, ignite the Industrial Revolution, and eventually create an empire that reached nearly every corner of the globe. But every great transformation starts quietly. So before we move into kings, battles and revolutions, imagine England as it once was. Cold winds moving across open hills, villages lit only by firelight, ancient paths cutting through dark forests, and generations of people living without any idea that the world would one day study their history. That is where our journey begins. Imagine the land as it once was, not green fields and hedgerows, not stone walls or quiet villages, something older, wilder, and more still than anything we know today. 30,000 years ago, the land we now call England was connected to the rest of Europe. There was no sea between them. Where the English Channel now spreads out cold and grey, there was instead a wide, marshy plain. Forests of pine and birch stretched in every direction. Mammoths moved slowly through the mist. Rivers ran where no rivers run today. And across that plain, something remarkable happened. People came. People came. The first modern humans to walk upon this land arrived slowly, over generations, following herds of animals northward and westward, across what geographers would one day name Doggerland, that now submerged world beneath the North Sea. They came not as conquerors, they came simply as people, curious, wandering, looking for food and shelter and somewhere safe to rest. They left almost nothing behind. A few flint tools, faint scratches on cave walls, bones buried in soft earth. And yet, buried within their descendants, something of them remained. Scientists studying ancient DNA have traced direct genetic lines between modern English people and remains at least 9,000 years old. The faces have changed. The language is unrecognizable. But somewhere deep in the biology of the people who live on that island today, those earliest wanderers still echo. Breathe out slowly. You are drifting back, 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 back through time. The island grew quieter as the climate changed. The great ice sheets that had covered much of northern Europe slowly, over thousands of years, began to melt. The sea levels rose. And Doggerland, that wide marshy bridge between Britain and the continent, sank beneath the water, quietly, over centuries. The land became an island. Now the only way in was by sea. And still, people came. They crossed in small boats, hugging the coastline, reading the stars in the wind. They brought new ideas with them, new ways of growing food, new ways of speaking. They were farmers, where the people before them had been hunters. They planted seeds in cleared ground. They kept animals in enclosures. They settled in one place and called it home. These were the people who built the first villages of Britain, small clusters of round houses with thatched roofs, fire pits in the centre, animals sleeping nearby for warmth, children learning the names of plants and stars from grandparents who sat by the fire in the evenings. Life was hard, but it had its own quiet rhythm. They buried their dead in long mounds of earth called barrows. Carefully, with care and intention, they placed objects beside the bodies, tools, ornaments, food for the journey ahead. These barrows still rise gently from the English countryside today, thousands of years later, grassed over, ancient, silent. If you walk through the English downlands on a quiet morning, you can still find them. Humps in the earth that remember something the living have forgotten. Let that settle in your mind, the image of those quiet mounds, those gentle hills that hold memory. Around 3,000 years before the Common Era, a new group arrived. Archaeologists know them by the shape of their pottery, rounded, bell-shaped vessels that earned them the name the Beaker People. They were a restless, curious group who gradually settled into the rhythms of agricultural life. And they brought with them something new, an understanding of metals. Copper first, then bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that would define the next 1,000 years of human civilization. Bronze was harder than stone. It held an edge. It could be shaped into tools, into weapons, into objects of beauty. And Britain had something very precious buried in its western hills and river valleys: tin. Rich deposits of tin that, when combined with copper from other lands, produced the bronze that warriors across the ancient world needed. Britain was, in those ancient days, one of the great suppliers of the ancient world. Traders came from distant places, from the shores of the Mediterranean, from the eastern reaches of the known world, to trade for that tin. English metal ended up in the hands of Egyptian craftsmen, in the weapons of Mycenaean warriors. The island on the edge of the world was already connected to everything. And slowly, the island was changing. It was no longer just a place people passed through. It was becoming a place with its own identity, its own rituals, its own relationship with the land and sky. There is a place in Severn, England, where the land opens out into a wide, treeless plain. The sky above it is vast and pale. The wind moves through the grass in long waves, like breath. And standing in the middle of that plain, rising against the sky, are stones. Large, ancient, impossible stones. Stonehenge. You may have seen photographs of it, but try now to imagine it as it was when it was first raised, around 2,200 years before the Common Era. Not crumbling and partial as it stands today, but complete, towering, surrounded by activity and life. A place where people gathered from across the land to mark the turning of the year, to honour the dead, to speak with whatever forces they believed moved through the world. The largest stones at Stonehenge weigh as much as 25 tons. They were brought from quarries in what is now Wales, a journey of hundreds of miles, across rivers and hills and rough terrain. No wheels, no machinery, just human strength and human ingenuity and an enormous shared determination to do something that had never been done before. Think of what that took. Not just the physical labour, though that was extraordinary. It required coordination, planning, authority. Someone had to be able to say, "We will do this together," and people had to listen and agree. The people who built Stonehenge had enough food to spare, enough surplus to free a large group of workers from farming. They had networks of travel and trade across the island. They had leaders whose word carried weight. This was not a simple society. It was a civilization, small by later standards, but a civilization nonetheless. Not far from Stonehenge, archaeologists found the grave of a man they call the Amesbury Archer. He was buried with more objects than almost any other burial of his time. Copper knives, golden ornaments, tools, offerings. He may have been a priest, or a chief, or a traveller of great importance. His grave tells us that society had already sorted itself into layers. Some people had more than others. Some people were honoured in death in ways that others not. The Salisbury Plain, where Stonehenge stands, was the centre of something meaningful in those ancient days. Villages clustered around it. Paths led toward it from many directions. It was, in a real sense, a sacred heart, the spiritual centre of a small civilization that spread across the southern part of the island. Let your mind rest there for a moment, on that quiet, windy plain, on those ancient stones standing patient in the morning mist. As the centuries turned, the island continued to change. The Bronze Age people were organised into tribes and kingdoms, loose, shifting arrangements of loyalty and violence and agricultural life. They built hill forts, settlements perched on raised ground, ringed with wooden walls, overlooking the valleys below. Warfare was real. The remains of people who died in battle have been found across England, their bones bearing the marks of blades and arrows. Life was precious and fragile. But there was beauty, too. The rivers of Britain were considered sacred, places where the gods lived, where offerings could be made, where prayers could cross from the human world into what one lay beyond. Well, definitely fair. Archaeologists have pulled extraordinary objects from English rivers, swords and shields and ornaments thrown into the water as gifts, as thanks, as pleas. The people of ancient Britain looked at the world and saw it alive with spirit. The river spoke, the hill remembered, the stone held something within it. That sense of the land as a living thing, sacred, powerful, watching, would persist in different forms through everything that came after. From the 7th century before the Common Era, a new presence made itself felt on the island: the Celts. They came from the continent in waves, not all at once, not as a single army. They brought iron, a metal harder and more readily available than bronze, and with iron came a change in the balance of power across Britain. Iron tools turned tougher ground, iron weapons gave their wielders an advantage in battle. The existing tribes, armed with bronze, found themselves facing something they had not encountered before. Gradually, Celtic culture became dominant. The Celtic languages, ancestors of modern Welsh and Cornish, and the Gaelic languages of Scotland and Ireland, became the tongue of Britain. Celtic art, with its beautiful flowing curves and spiralling patterns, decorated everything from swords to pottery to the walls of great halls. Celtic society was organised around two great pillars: the warriors, men and women who fought, who trained, who competed for honour and glory in battle and in the great halls where their chiefs held court, and the druids. The druids were the priests and scholars and memory keepers of the Celtic world. They were not the mysterious, shadowy figures that later legend made them. They were, in their time, the most learned people in Britain. They memorised enormous quantities of lore, history, ritual, and knowledge. It took 20 years to train as a druid. They held authority that kings could not dismiss. The druids tended the sacred groves and the sacred fires. They interpreted signs in the world. They stood between the human community and the forces they believed shaped it. Religion in the Celtic world was intimate with nature. The world was not divided neatly into sacred and ordinary. Everything was touched by spirit. The oak tree, the running stream, the standing stone, the shape of a cloud at dawn. In time, the larger hill forts began to decline as bigger, more stable kingdoms emerged. By the century before Rome arrived, Britain was divided into a mosaic of Celtic kingdoms, some small, some larger, some prosperous and connected to the trade routes of Europe, some remote and resistant to outside influence. A Greek explorer named Pytheas had sailed to the island around 325 years before the Common Era and recorded what he found: a land of many independent rulers, of tin mines worked by skilled craftsmen, of a people generally at peace among themselves, though always ready for war. The Mediterranean world knew Britain existed. They knew it was rich in metal. They knew it was on the edge of the known world, but none of them had thought much about what might lie beyond that edge, until Rome came. Julius Caesar was a practical man. He was also an ambitious one. When he landed his legions on the shores of Britain in 55 years before the Common Era, he was not primarily interested in conquest. He was interested in reputation. In the political theatre of Rome, nothing said power quite like marching an army to the edge of the known world and returning safely. Britain was the edge of the world. Caesar went there. The Britons he encountered were not helpless. They fought from chariots in a style the Romans had not seen in generations. They were brave, fast, and fierce. But they were disunited, each tribe fighting for itself, unable to coordinate a response to the organised, disciplined force Caesar brought. Caesar pushed them back. He accepted tribute from several kings. He impressed his enemies and impressed Rome. And then he left. He returned the following year, went further, fought harder, and left again, drawn back by other crises, other demands. Britain was interesting, but not urgent. It remained on the edge of Roman awareness for another century. Trade continued. Some British kings maintained diplomatic relationships with Rome, but Rome itself was consumed by civil wars and transformation. Britain could wait. It waited for almost 100 years. When Rome finally came to stay, In 43 years after the Common Era, under Emperor Claudius, it came with purpose. 4 legions landed in the southeast. The resistance, though fierce in places, was ultimately overcome. The Romans moved with a speed and coordination that the divided British tribes could not match. Some kings surrendered and were treated as allies. Others fought and were defeated. Within a few years, Rome controlled most of what is now England and Wales. A new world had arrived on the island. Close your eyes a little more deeply. Imagine the change that Rome brought. In the places where there had been wooden hill forts and dirt tracks, there were now straight roads of cut stone, stretching from one end of the province to the other. These roads did not wander. They did not follow the shape of the land, the way ancient paths had. They cut through it, over it, around it. They connected everything to everything else. You could walk from the northern frontier to the southern coast, and the road would never disappear beneath your feet. In the valleys and river crossings, towns grew up, planned, organized, built with stone. Forums where business was conducted. Bathhouses where water was heated by fires beneath the floors. Markets, libraries, schools, temples to Roman gods, and later to the new god the Romans were slowly adopting from the east. The Roman town was a different way of being in the world. It was a world of law, written down, administered by appointed officials, applied imperfectly but consistently across a vast territory. A world of commerce, where money circulated and trade happened at a scale the island had never seen. A world of literacy, where educated people could exchange ideas across hundreds of miles simply by writing them down. And a world of luxury for those who could afford it. The Roman villas scattered across the English countryside were extraordinary places. Mosaic floors with scenes of hunting and mythology, heated rooms, gardens planted with herbs and flowers. Wine from the Mediterranean, olive oil, fine pottery, glass. These were the homes of the Romano-British elite, people who had embraced Roman ways and risen within the Roman system. But most people did not live in villas. Most people were farmers. They paid their taxes in grain and in money. They used the Roman roads to take their goods to market. They may have adopted some Roman habits, a new kind of pot, a new way of roasting their pigs. But the deep rhythms of their lives, the planting and the harvest, the rearing of animals, the marking of seasons, these continued much as they had before. Rome brought something else to Britain too. Something that would outlast the roads and the villas and the bathhouses. Something that would shape the island's identity more than anything Rome built in stone. Christianity. The new faith had spread quietly through the Roman world, carried by merchants and soldiers and missionaries. It arrived in Britain during the Roman period. We do not know exactly when or how. But by the 4th century, Britain had Christian communities, Christian bishops, a small but growing church, and that church would survive what Rome could not. Nothing lasts forever. Rome's grip on Britain loosened, slowly, then all at once. Through the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Roman Empire was under pressure from every direction. Barbarian peoples pushed in from the north and east. Pretenders to the throne rose and fell. The economy strained under the weight of endless military spending. In Britain, Saxon raiders began appearing along the eastern coast, fast, violent, hard to predict. The Romans built a chain of defensive forts along what they called the Saxon shore, but the raids continued. In 367, something extraordinary happened. The Saxons from the east, the Picts from the north of Scotland, and the Scots from Ireland coordinated a simultaneous attack on Roman Britain. The great defensive wall in the north was overwhelmed. Roman forces were scattered. For a time, the province fell into chaos. Rome recovered, but it never quite regained what it had lost. Over the following decades, as crisis after crisis struck the wider empire, Britain's garrison was stripped away. Soldiers pulled south to deal with more immediate emergencies on the continent. In 407, a Roman commander in Britain named Constantine III stripped the remaining troops from the island and crossed to Gaul, declaring himself emperor. He was not the first to do this, and he would not be the last. In 409, Rome withdrew what remained of its official presence from Britain. The administration, the officials, the connection to the larger world, they simply left, and the island was quiet again. Not peaceful, the years after Rome's departure were difficult and dangerous. The towns that Rome had built began to decay. Trade networks collapsed. The literate administrative class that had kept things running found itself without support. The countryside, always more populous than the towns, reverted to older patterns. The memory of Rome lingered in the ruined walls of abandoned villas, in the long straight roads that still crossed the land, useful even when no one remembered who had built them. In the language, Latin words woven into everyday speech. And in the church. The Christian communities of Britain survived the end of Roman administration. They continued to meet, to pray, to baptize. The faith that Rome had brought became, in a sense, more truly British than anything else Rome had left behind. But new forces were stirring just across the water. Let your breathing slow, in and out. After Rome, Britain did not simply fall silent and wait. The kingdoms that emerged to fill the vacuum were real and active places, ruled by running feet with running time. Others were Celtic chiefs who'd always existed outside Rome's direct reach. Britain in the 5th century was a mosaic of small kingdoms, each trying to make sense of a world that had changed too quickly. And then the ships came again. From across the North Sea, from the sandy coastlines of what is now northern Germany and Denmark, people began to cross. Not in great armadas at first, just small groups. Warriors hired as mercenaries by local British kings who needed fighters and could not find enough of their own. The most famous of these early arrivals came at the invitation of a king named Vortigern, who brought in Saxon warriors named Hengist and Horsa to help defend his southeastern kingdom. It was an arrangement that seemed sensible at the time. It did not remain sensible for long. The mercenaries fought well, and then they noticed something. The land was fertile, the defences were thin, and there were many more people in their homeland who would be willing to cross the water if someone told them what waited on the other side. The flow of Anglo-Saxon settlers into Britain began in the middle of the 5th century and continued for generations. The Saxons came from the region of the Eldova. The Angles came from a peninsula in what is now Denmark, a place called, in their own tongue, Angel, a name that would eventually give the island its name. The Jutes came from Jutland. Smaller groups came from other coastal peoples of northern Europe. They spread across the eastern and southern parts of Britain, pushing the existing Celtic-speaking population westward into Wales, into Cornwall, into the Highlands of the north. The process was not uniform. In some places it was violent and abrupt, in others it was slower and more mixed. But the overall direction was clear. The language of the newcomers, a Germanic tongue that would eventually become English, was replacing the Celtic languages in the lowland areas. The new kingdoms that emerged were warrior societies. Status was built on courage and loyalty, and the ability to inspire men to follow you into battle. The most powerful man was the one whose warband was largest and most successful. He held his court in a great hall where warriors feasted together, where stories were told of famous deeds, where gifts were given by the Lord to the men who served him. We know something of that world from one of the great literary survivals of the Anglo-Saxon period, the poem Beowulf. Though written down later, it preserves the values and atmosphere of this early world. The hero is defined by his courage and his loyalty. The king is generous, brave, doomed to pass. The world is dangerous and beautiful in equal measure. There is always another monster beyond the firelight. Let that image rest in your mind. The warm light of the hall, the sound of the story, the darkness outside, full of wind and uncertainty. The existing Britons did not simply disappear. Some were absorbed into the new order, farmers and craftsmen who worked the land under new lords and paid their dues in a different language. Others retreated westward, carrying their traditions and their stories with them. The memory of a great British warrior who had resisted the invaders, a figure who would eventually grow into the legend of King Arthur, survived in the stories they told. Whether Arthur was a real person, a Romano-British captain, a local king, a war leader of some kind, we cannot say with certainty. But something happened in those years of resistance that was worth remembering. Something that people did not want to let go. The legend grew, slowly, in the dark. You can let your eyes stay closed. There is no need to do anything at all right now, except listen. By the late 6th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had settled into a rough arrangement. Several major kingdoms competed for dominance: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, Wessex in the south, along with smaller kingdoms scattered across the island. They fought one another, formed alliances, married their children to each other's children, and occasionally acknowledged one king as superior to all the others. The title given to such a supremely powerful king was Brectwalda, ruler of Britain. But Britain, in those days, meant only a part of the island. The Celtic kingdoms of Wales and the far north existed separately, maintaining their older traditions, their own churches, their own stories. Into this world, a missionary arrived. His name was Augustine. He had been sent by Pope Gregory in Rome, a man of learning and vision who had looked at the map and seen on its northern edge a pagan island that had once been Christian and could be so again. Gregory dispatched Augustine to Kent in 597, and Augustine arrived at the court of the Kentish king Ethelbert. Ethelbert was a pragmatic man. He was also married to a Frankish Christian princess, a woman named Bertha, who had been quietly practicing her faith in Canterbury for years with a small church of her own. When Augustine arrived, the king was prepared. Within a year, Ethelbert had converted. His example drew others. Within a few more years, the kings of East Anglia, Essex, and Northumbria had all received the new faith. But conversion was not always stable. Some kings lapsed when their Christian rulers died. Others were caught between the missionaries from Rome and a second, different tradition of Christianity that had been preserved in the monasteries of Ireland and the Celtic world, a form of the faith that had developed its own customs, its own calendar, its own emphasis on the monastery rather than the bishop's seat. The tension between these two traditions came to a head in Northumbria in 1664. A king named Oswy, himself a follower of the Celtic form of Christianity, had married a Kentish princess who followed Roman practice. This meant that the most important feast in the Christian year, Easter, was celebrated on different days in the same royal household. The king celebrated one Sunday while his queen celebrated another. It was, even in those days, recognised as absurd. Oswy called a great council, a synod, at the monastery of Whitby to settle the matter once and for all. Representatives of both traditions argued their cases. The Celtic monks pointed to the authority of St. Columba, the great Irish missionary. The Roman party pointed to St. Peter himself, to whom, according to the Gospels, Christ had given the keys of heaven. Oswy listened carefully. Then he made his decision. He would follow the Roman tradition, he said, because if St. Peter held the keys to heaven, it would be unwise to defy him. The laughter that followed was reported even in the chronicles. But the decision mattered. From that point forward, England, and the word England was beginning to be used now, made for the Angles, was aligned with Rome. The Pope sent a new Archbishop of Canterbury, a scholarly Greek named Theodore of Tarsus. He spent 2 decades organising the English Church into a coherent institution, with defined dioceses, appointed bishops, and regular councils. The Church became the first organisation since Rome to reach across all of England with a single authority. And in the monasteries, those quiet places of stone and prayer and candlelight, something remarkable was being created. Books. The Anglo-Saxon monasteries became centres of learning. Monks copied manuscripts, illuminated them with extraordinary beauty, and produced original works of history and theology and poetry. The most important of these was written by a monk in Northumbria named Bede. His Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written in the early 8th century, is the foundation of English historical writing. Without Bede, we would know almost nothing of those early centuries. Bede called them the English. He meant all the Germanic-speaking peoples of the island. He gave them a common name before they had a common kingdom. Language, as it so often does, ran ahead of politics. Rest deeply now. The 8th century was a time of building. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated. Small kingdoms were absorbed into larger ones through war and marriage, and simply outlasting their rivals. By the early 8th century, 3 kingdoms dominated England. Northumbria stretched across the north, from the Humber estuary to the Scottish Highlands. Mercia commanded the Midlands, a vast, powerful kingdom in the centre of the island. And Wessex held the south. Each kingdom had its moment of greatness. Northumbria shone first. Under kings like Oswald and Oswiu, it reached a height of cultural and religious achievement that made it famous across Europe. Its monasteries, Lindisfarne, Jarrow, Wearmouth, were centres of learning and artistic production. The Lindisfarne Gospels, illuminated in the late 7th century with extraordinary skill, are among the most beautiful books ever made. The golden age of Northumbrian culture lasted perhaps a century, and then military pressure from Mercia and from the Pictish kingdoms of the north gradually wore it down. Mercia's great moment came in the 8th century, under a king named Offa. Offa was formidable. He extended Mercian control over most of southern England, reducing Kent, East Anglia, and Sussex to subordinate status. He conducted diplomatic correspondence with Charlemagne, the great Frankish king who was consolidating Europe under his own power. Offa minted coins. Mercia was the first English kingdom since Rome to do so seriously, and on those coins he called himself Rex Anglorum, King of the English. He was not yet, quite, King of all the English. But the title spoke to something real, a growing sense that this island contained a single people, even if it did not yet have a single ruler. Offa's most visible legacy is the great earthwork that still bears his name, Offa's Dyke. A long ditch and rampart running for 170 miles along the border between England and Wales. It did not wall Wales out entirely, but it marked a line. Here is England, there is something else. That line, remarkably, has remained roughly where Offa drew it for over 1,200 years. And then came Wessex. Wessex had always been there, in the south. It had its moments and its capable kings. But it found its true greatness not in a time of prosperity, but in a time of catastrophe. Because the Vikings were coming. On a June morning in 793, the monks at the monastery of Lindisfarne looked out and saw ships on the sea. The ships moved fast, driven by oars and by a square sail. They were not trading vessels. The men in them carried axes and swords. They came ashore without warning, without negotiation, without mercy. The monastery, that quiet place of prayer and illuminated manuscripts and holy relics accumulated over a century, was pillaged. The monks were killed or captured. The church was burned. And the ships sailed away again, back across the water. A scholar in the south wrote that it seemed like the end of the world was beginning. He was not entirely wrong. The Viking raids on England were not a single event. They were a pattern that repeated and intensified over the following decades. The Norsemen, Danes and Norwegians and Swedes had developed the finest boats of the age. Their longships could cross open ocean and yet were shallow enough to sail up rivers. They could be beached directly on shore. They gave their crews an astonishing range and speed. At first the raids were seasonal. They came in summer, took what they could, and went home before winter. But in 1866, something changed. A large force landed in East Anglia. The chronicles call it the Great Heathen Army, and it was something England had never faced before. Not a raiding party, but an army of conquest. Led by men whose names have come down to us, Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, Uber, the army swept across England with a speed that left the kingdoms reeling. They captured York. They subjugated Northumbria. They moved into Mercia. They killed the king of East Anglia in battle and absorbed his kingdom. By 871, only one English kingdom had not fallen, Wessex, and its king had just died, leaving the throne to a young man barely into adulthood. His name was Alfred. Alfred fought. He fought 9 battles in his first year as king. 9 battles, one after another, each one a desperate effort to hold the line. He did not always win, but he did not lose entirely. And when the military situation became too desperate, he bought time the only way he could, with money. A payment to the Viking leaders, buying peace for a season. It did not last. In the winter of 1878, the Danes struck again. Alfred was caught unprepared, his court scattered, his army dissolved. He fled into the marshes of Somerset, hiding in the fenlands with a small band of followers, while the Vikings controlled most of Wessex. The story they told about Alfred in those dark weeks, the story of the burned cakes, speaks to something true, even if it may be embellished. A fugitive king, sheltering in a peasant's cottage, distracted by the weight of his kingdom's fate, fails to watch the cakes on the fire. The peasant woman scolds him, not knowing who he is. He apologizes. There is something very human in that image. A man who carries the weight of a nation's future, who can be distracted, who can fail at small things while holding on to great ones. Alfred held on. In the spring of 878, he summoned his forces. A miracle in itself, men coming out of hiding, gathering at a pre-arranged point, trusting that the king was still alive and still fighting. And they came. They met the Danish army at the Battle of Edington, and they won. The Danish king Guthrum agreed not just to leave Wessex, but to be baptized as a Christian. Alfred stood as his godfather, a remarkable moment, the man who had nearly destroyed Alfred's kingdom, kneeling to receive the faith of his enemy. The peace that followed, negotiated and renegotiated over the following years, divided England roughly in half. The north and east, where Danish settlers were now thick upon the ground, became the Danelaw, a region that would eventually be reclaimed, but which, for now, operated under its own rules. The south and west remained Alfred's south. But Alfred did not simply hold on. He ordered the construction of a network of fortified towns across Wessex. Burhs, they were called, from which we get the word borough. Strategically placed so that no one in the kingdom was more than a day's travel from safety. He organised a standing military force, men who rotated in and out of service, so that there was always a trained body of soldiers available, not the old system where everyone came at once and farms were left untended. He reformed the law. He gathered the best legal traditions of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and codified them. He promoted literacy. He learned to read Latin himself as an adult, which was remarkable for a king of his time, and oversaw the translation of important books into English, including works of history and philosophy and theology. He ordered the creation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a continuous record of English history written in English rather than Latin. In a time when the very survival of England was in doubt, Alfred found the space and the vision to think about what England should become if it survived. It survived. Alfred died in 1899, having transformed his kingdom and laid the foundations for something larger. His children and grandchildren would continue his work. His son Edward pushed into the Danelaw. His daughter Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, one of the remarkable figures of English history, led armies into Danish territory and won. And Alfred's grandson Æthelstein became, in 1927, the first king who could genuinely call himself King of all England. England existed. It was a real thing now. Rest. Let the rain fall softly in your imagination. The century after Æthelstein was not uniformly peaceful. Viking pressure continued. New waves, new leaders, new crises. The reign of a king known to history as Ethelred the Unready, though his name meant something closer to badly counselled than simply unprepared, brought a period of weakness. Danish attacks intensified. The king paid enormous sums to buy peace and found that peace, when purchased, rarely lasted. In 1013, the Danish king Svein Forkbeard invaded and briefly took the throne. He died within months, but his son Cunut returned and established a lasting Danish kingship over England. Cunut was, by most accounts, a capable and fair ruler. He treated the English nobility with respect. He organised the kingdom efficiently. He was a Christian king who gave generously to the church. Under him, England was part of a North Sea empire, Denmark, Norway, and England under one crown. But Cunut's dynasty did not outlast him by much. His sons reigned briefly and poorly. And in 1004 too, the English nobility looked to the old royal line, the descendants of Alfred, and brought Edward, son of Ethelred, back from exile in Normandy to take the throne. Edward was known as the Confessor. Why? He was pious, gentle, and genuinely beloved, but he was also politically ineffective and failed in the most basic royal duty, producing an heir. When Edward died in January 1066, the question of succession was immediately in crisis. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, was elected king by the leading men of the realm. He was an able soldier and administrator, and his claim was reasonable, if not royal by blood. But it was contested. Now, Condeen Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, claimed the throne on the basis of a prior agreement between his predecessor and a former English king. And William, Duke of Normandy, a formidable, ambitious, and ruthless leader, claimed that Edward had promised the throne to him personally. In September 1006, Harald Hardrada invaded from the north. Harold Godwinson marched his army north at extraordinary speed and met the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. The battle was a decisive English victory. Harald Hardrada was killed. The Viking threat to England effectively ended on that battlefield. Harold had barely caught his breath when the news came. William had landed in the south. There are moments in history when the world pivots on a single day. October 14th, 1066. Harold gathered his army and marched south. They had just fought a hard battle. They were tired. But Harold could not wait. He needed to confront William before the Normans could spread further across the south of England. They met near Hastings, on a long ridge above a valley. The English held the high ground. They formed their shield wall, the traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive formation. Shields locked together, men standing close as brothers, waiting for the enemy to break upon them. It had worked at Stamford Bridge. It had worked at dozens of battles before, but William had cavalry and archers, and he had trained his men to fight in ways the English were not expecting. The Normans attacked, the English held. The Normans pretended to retreat. Some of the English broke their line to pursue, and the Normans turned on them. The fighting lasted most of the day, and sometime in the afternoon, Harold was killed. The English army, leaderless, began to fall apart. By evening, the battle was over. On Christmas Day, 1006, William of Normandy was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. England had a new master, and England would never quite be the same. The Norman conquest was total, in a way that previous invasions had not been. William distributed English land to his Norman followers with a thoroughness that was almost mechanical. Within a generation, virtually the entire English landowning class had been replaced by Normans and their allies. The language of the court, of law, of literature, became French. English continued to be spoken by the common people, but it was the language of those with no power. For a century and more, England lived with this division, a French-speaking elite ruling over an English-speaking majority. But languages, like rivers, find their level eventually. The French and English would blend into something new, something that became, in time, the language you are listening to right now. William was a systematic man. He understood that to hold England, he needed to know England. And so, in 1086, he ordered an unprecedented survey of the entire kingdom. Every manor, every village, every ploughland, who owned it, what it was worth, who had owned it before the conquest, what taxes could be extracted from it. The result was an enormous document, 2 volumes that the English came to call the Domesday Book. The name was ominous, the book from which there was no appeal, like the judgment at the end of time. And indeed, what the Domesday Book recorded was, for the vast majority of landowners, final. The Norman order was established. The English dispossession was complete. The social structure William imposed on England was feudalism in its most formal expression. At the top, the king. Everything in England, every acre of land, every river, every forest, belonged to the king in principle. He granted portions of this land to his barons in exchange for their military service and their loyalty. The barons in turn granted portions to their knights, who owed them service in battle. And beneath the knights, the common people, the villagers, the farmers, the craftsmen, who worked the land and owed a portion of everything they produced to the lord above them. The system was designed for control and for extraction. It was also, in its way, a system of mutual obligation. The lord owed his people protection and justice in exchange for their labour and their loyalty. Whether that obligation was honoured depended very much on the particular lord. For most people, life continued along familiar grooves. The fields needed ploughing in spring and harvest in autumn, regardless of who held the manor above them. The seasons did not care about politics. But the taxes were heavier under Norman lords than they had been under Anglo-Saxon ones. The lords asserted their rights more thoroughly. The forest laws, William's reservation of large tracts of land for his own hunting, meant that peasants, who had always been able to supplement their diet with wild game, now faced serious punishment for doing so. England, under the Normans, was a more controlled place, but it was also in some ways a more connected place. The Norman lords maintained their ties to France, to Normandy, to the wider world of French-speaking European culture. England was now part of a larger network. Trade expanded. Ideas crossed the channel. Students who had been educated in the great schools of France came home to teach a more alive crimes. The University of Oxford began gathering scholars in the 12th century. The precise date is uncertain, as with so many things in this unwritten tradition, and it grew into one of the great intellectual centres of the medieval world. The castle rose across England, that most Norman of symbols, not just a military fortification, but a statement of power. Over 100 castles across England and Wales by the early 12th century, their stone towers visible from miles away, saying to anyone who looked, "We are here. We are watching. This land is ours." Let your breathing deepen a little. We are moving forward in time, through the 12th century, through the extraordinary reign of Henry II, a brilliant, restless man who reformed the law, extended English power into Ireland and Wales, and destroyed his friendship with his Archbishop Thomas Becket in the most dramatic fashion. Becket, once Henry's close friend and chancellor, became his most implacable opponent when he was made Archbishop of Canterbury. The dispute was about power, whether the king or the Pope had final authority over the English Church and its clergy. It raged for years. Becket went into exile, returned, and then, in December 1170, 4 of Henry's knights rode to Canterbury Cathedral and murdered him at the altar. The killing of an archbishop in his own cathedral shocked Europe. Henry was forced into public penance. He walked barefoot through the streets and submitted to being beaten by monks as an act of atonement. The Pope declared Becket a martyr and saint within 2 years. Henry's reputation never fully recovered. But England's legal institutions were stronger for his reign. He reformed the courts, introduced juries, extended the reach of royal justice. These reforms are considered the foundations of English common law, the legal tradition that, centuries later, would spread across much of the world through English colonisation. But it was a later, weaker king who produced England's most important legal document. King John was the youngest son of Henry II. He was clever in some ways, a competent administrator in peacetime, but catastrophically bad in war and in diplomacy. He lost almost all of England's territories in France. He quarrelled with the Pope and was excommunicated. He taxed his barons so heavily and so arbitrarily that they finally, in 1215, took up arms against him. In June 1215, John met the rebel barons at a field called Runningmead, beside the Thames, and there, under enormous pressure, he set his seal to a document that would echo through history. Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Most of its specific provisions were technical, details about inheritance law, about the rights of merchants, about the limits of taxation. They were the grievances of barons and bishops and merchants, not a general declaration of human rights. But some of its language went further. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. The king would not deny or delay right or justice. These phrases, understood in their context, meant something profound. The king was not above the law, he was subject to it. There were limits on what even the most powerful man in England could do to any free person. The document was imperfect. It was a peace treaty between a king and his barons, and it failed initially. John immediately sought to have it annulled. War resumed, and John died of dysentery in 1216 before it could be resolved. But his 9-year-old son Henry III issued revised versions of the Charter, and gradually it became something permanent, a foundational document of English law. Magna Carta did not create democracy. It did not end tyranny. But it established a principle that would be built upon for centuries, the idea that power is not unlimited, that even kings must answer to the law. Let that idea rest quietly in your mind as you drift a little deeper into rest. The 14th century brought catastrophe. England in 1340 had perhaps 6 million people. The towns that had grown slowly through the Norman and medieval period were thriving. Trade with the continent was extensive. The wool industry, English wool was the finest in Europe, made the great merchants of the eastern counties wealthy beyond anything their grandparents could have imagined. The universities were full of students. The great cathedrals that still stand across England were being built and adorned. And then, in the autumn of 1348, a ship arrived from the continent. It carried rats. The rats carried fleas. The fleas carried something that had already swept across Asia and Europe with devastating speed. Something so terrible that later generations would simply call it the Black Death. The disease, bubonic plague, in its most aggressive form, spread through a population that had never encountered it and had no immunity to it. It spread through the crowded streets of towns. It spread through the markets and the churchyards. It spread through the close quarters of villages where people shared wells and touched each other's hands and breathed the same air. Within a year of arriving in England, it had killed perhaps 40% of the population. 40%. We can say the number, but it is hard to truly comprehend. In every village, Some houses simply went silent. In every town, the grave diggers could not keep up. Monks and priests who tended the sick died alongside them. In some communities, there was no one left with enough strength to bury the dead. A chronicler of the time wrote of towns once packed with life, reduced to silence, of the dead lying in the streets, of a world that seemed to have lost its purpose. The plague did not come just once. It returned in 1361, and again in the years following, each time killing more. By the end of the 14th century, England's population had been reduced by perhaps half from what it had been at the century's beginning. It would not recover to pre-plague levels for nearly 300 years. But the plague changed more than numbers. When half the people are gone, the people who remain find themselves in a different world. The labour that had once been abundant was now scarce. Landlords who had always been able to find enough workers to plough their fields suddenly found themselves bargaining, offering better terms, raising wages. Peasants who had been tied to the land, who had never been able to leave without their lord's permission, began to leave, to seek better conditions elsewhere, to negotiate from a position of new strength. The feudal system, which had been built on the assumption of abundant, controllable labour, began to erode, slowly, unevenly, but irreversibly. And something else shifted too. In the years and decades after the plague, English, the language of the common people, not the French of the court, began to reassert itself. In 1362, English was made the official language of the law courts. In 1382, the first complete English translation of the Bible was completed. And in the 1390s, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by pilgrims on their way to the shrine of Thomas Becket, told in English. Told with humour and humanity, and an extraordinary range of voices from across English society. Chaucer gave the English language a new kind of dignity. He showed that English could carry stories of depth and beauty and truth. The language of the ploughman and the merchant and the wife of Bath was worthy of art. England in the 15th century turned on itself. The 100 Years' War with France, that long, complicated conflict that had brought famous victories like Agincourt and equally famous disasters, ended in 1453, with England holding almost nothing on the continent. The men who came home from France were experienced fighters with no wars to fight, loyal to lords who now had reason to use them against each other. The king was Henry VI, a gentle, pious man who suffered from serious mental illness. In the periods of his incapacity, power fell to the great nobles around him, and among those nobles, old rivalries and competing claims to the throne began to sharpen into something dangerous. Two great dynasties of the royal family faced each other. The House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, the House of York, whose symbol was a white rose. And between them, over 3 decades, from 1455 to 1485, England was torn apart by what history would call the Wars of the Roses. The details are complicated, and the names blur together in the chronicles. Battles won and lost, kings deposed and restored and deposed again, alliances formed and broken with bewildering speed. But through the turbulence, certain moments stand out. The Battle of Towton in 1461, fought in a snowstorm, leaving perhaps 30,000 men dead in a single day, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The Yorkist Edward IV emerged from it as king and seemed, for a time, to have ended the crisis. He had not. The twisting, violent story of the Wars of the Roses ended at last at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 485. A Lancastrian claimant named Henry Tudor, who had spent years in exile in France, who had Welsh ancestry and a tenuous claim to the throne, landed in Wales with the French army and marched into England. Richard III, the last Yorkist king, rode out to meet him. Richard was killed in the battle. He was the last English king to die in combat. His crown, legend says, was found on the battlefield and placed on Henry Tudor's head then and there. Henry VII took the throne. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the two dynasties. The long civil war was over, and England was about to enter one of the most dramatic periods in its history. Let the warmth of it settle around you. The Tudor dynasty that Henry VII founded was, from the beginning, aware of how uncertain its position was. The first Henry was careful, methodical, almost miserly in his management of the crown's resources. He was not loved, but he was effective. He stabilised England's finances and secured the succession. His son, Henry VIII, was everything his father was not. Tall, athletic, brilliant, musical, literary, Henry VIII, in his youth, was the image of what a Renaissance prince should be. He wrote poetry and music. He debated theology. He hunted and jousted and danced. His court was the most glittering in England, perhaps in Northern Europe. For a while, the transformation of Henry VIII from Renaissance prince to tyrant king happened gradually, driven by two great obsessions. The first was the need for a male heir. Catherine of Aragon, his Spanish queen, his brother's widow, had given him a daughter, the future Mary I, but no surviving son. Henry's dynasty depended on a male heir. The succession was his deepest anxiety. The second was Anne Boleyn. Anne was not simply a temptation. She was a Protestant, educated and intelligent, who genuinely believed in the reforming ideas that were spreading across Europe. When Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine so that he could marry Anne, and the Pope refused, Anne gave him an alternative. What if England did not need the Pope? The English Reformation was not primarily a theological event, not at first. It was a political one. In 1533, Parliament declared the King of England the supreme head of the Church of England. The connection to Rome was severed. Henry was excommunicated. He did not care. He married Anne. Anne gave him another daughter, Elizabeth, and then she lost his interest, was accused of adultery and treason, and was beheaded in 1536. Henry would marry 4 more times. Jane Seymour gave him the son he had always wanted, the future Edward VI, and died of complications from the birth. Anne of Cleves was divorced within months. Catherine Howard was beheaded for alleged infidelity. Catherine Parr survived him, the only wife to outlive the king. The dissolution of the monasteries, the closure of every monastery, convent and friary in England and Wales, was one of the most dramatic acts of the Reformation. Nearly 1,000 religious houses, accumulated over centuries, were stripped of their wealth and their land. The monks and nuns were pensioned off. The buildings were sold or given away or allowed to decay. The effect on the English landscape was permanent. The ruins of abbeys still stand across England, beautiful, roofless, their arches open to the sky. They are among the most evocative places in the country. Places where you can stand and feel the absence of something that was once alive. After the brief troubled reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, whose attempt to restore Catholicism included the burning of nearly 300 Protestants and earned her the name Bloody Mary. England received its most celebrated monarch, Elizabeth I. She was 25 years old when she came to the throne in 1558. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, she had grown up under circumstances that would have broken a lesser person. Her mother executed, her own status uncertain, her position in constant danger through the reigns of her half-siblings. She had learned to be cautious, to read people carefully, to say less than she thought. These were precisely the skills a monarch needed. Elizabeth settled England's religious question with characteristic pragmatism. She was Protestant, and England would be Protestant under her, but she had no desire, as she famously said, to make windows into men's souls. The Church of England she established was broad enough to accommodate most of her subjects. The most zealous Catholics on one side and the most radical Puritans on the other remained dissatisfied, but the vast middle of English religious life found a workable home in the Anglican settlement. Elizabeth never married. The question of her marriage and her heir was the great anxiety of her reign, debated endlessly in Parliament and in every court of Europe. She used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, always potentially available, never quite agreed upon, and in the end remained single, claiming to be married to England alone. Her reign was 44 years. They called it a golden age, and in many ways it was. Trade expanded. The wool trade, that had sustained English prosperity for centuries, was joined by new ventures, merchant companies trading to the Baltic, to the Mediterranean, to West Africa and the Americas. English ships ventured further than they had ever gone before. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe. Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored the first English colony in North America, a fragile settlement on Roanoke Island that would vanish without trace, leaving behind only mystery. The East India Company was chartered in 1600, its initial mandate modest, its eventual scope almost unimaginable. And England's culture flourished in a way it never had before. In a small theatre south of the Thames, a man from Stratford-upon-Avon was writing plays. William Shakespeare is the figure through whom Elizabethan England speaks most clearly to us. His plays are not historical documents. They are works of imagination, myth, language taken to its furthest reach. But they tell us something true about the England of their time, its confidence and its anxiety, its sense of humour and its love of language, its fascination with power and justice and what it means to be human. When Shakespeare puts words in the mouths of English kings, he is not writing biography. He is writing something deeper, a meditation on what it means to rule, to fail, to be responsible for other people's lives. Those plays were performed to audiences that included everyone from the groundlings standing in the yard to the nobility seated in galleries. England's culture, at its best, spoke to everyone. Elizabeth died in 1603. She left no heir. The throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of the two kingdoms that had been enemies for so long. You can let yourself sink deeper now. The 17th century brought England to a crisis it had never quite faced before. James I, and then his son, Charles I, found themselves in an escalating struggle with Parliament over power, over money, over the fundamental question of what kind of country England was going to be. Charles I was not a tyrant by temperament. He was actually quite gentle in private life, devoted to his family, a great collector of art. But he believed in the divine right of kings with an absoluteness that his kingdom could not accommodate. He believed that Parliament existed to advise and support the king, not to limit him. Parliament believed something very different. The conflict came to a head slowly, then all at once. In 1642, Charles marched into Parliament with armed men to arrest 5 leading members. They had already fled. The gesture was futile and catastrophically revealing. The king had shown his hand. He would use force against Parliament if he had to. Parliament responded in kind. The English Civil War was fought from 1642 to 1651. Royalists and parliamentarians, each believing they were defending the true constitution of England, fought each other across the breadth of the country. Families were divided. Communities were divided. The countryside bore the scars of sieges and skirmishes and the passage of armies. Oliver Cromwell emerged as the dominant military figure on the parliamentary side. A cavalry commander of extraordinary effectiveness, he shaped the new model army into a disciplined, motivated force that the Royalists could not match. The decisive battle came at Naseby in 1645, where the Royalist army was broken beyond recovery. Charles surrendered, was imprisoned, escaped, started more fighting, was recaptured, and in Parliament, or the portion of Parliament that Cromwell controlled after expelling the moderates, put the king on trial for treason against his own people. It was a legal argument without real precedent. A king could not commit treason against himself, or could he? The argument was that Charles held his power in trust for the people of England, and in betraying that trust, he had committed the deepest treason imaginable. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was executed on a scaffold outside Whitehall Palace. A king of England, executed by his own parliament. The execution sent shockwaves across Europe. It was unprecedented. It was shocking even to many who had opposed Charles. Whatever they had wanted, limits on royal power, protection of parliamentary rights, most people had not wanted this. But it had happened. And from it emerged the Republic, the Commonwealth, and then the military dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. Cromwell was a man of genuine faith and genuine ability, but his rule was deeply unpopular. His Puritan moral code, the closing of theatres, the regulation of recreation, the imposition of strict Sabbath observance, alienated ordinary English people who had fought the war for their political rights, not for a godly state. When Cromwell died in 1658, the Republic lasted barely 2 years longer. Parliament invited the exiled Charles II to return. He entered London on his birthday, May 29th, 1660, to cheering crowds. The monarchy was restored. But it was not the same monarchy. Parliament had established something it would never surrender. The king ruled, but Parliament controlled the money. And without money, a king could not rule effectively. England had found its balance. Imperfect, unwritten, but real. The restoration of Charles II brought stability and a kind of relief. Charles was witty, warm, adaptable, and politically shrewd. He understood the limits of his position and worked within them with considerable skill. His reign saw the continuation of England's overseas expansion, the founding of the Royal Society for Scientific Inquiry, and the cultural flourishing of the restored theatre and the arts. But his brother James II, who succeeded him in 1685, did not have Charles's instincts. James was Catholic, and he made little secret of his intention to roll back the restrictions on Catholic worship and public life. This alarmed England. The memory of the Civil War, of religious conflict, of what had happened when kings overreached, all of it was still raw in living memory. Parliament acted, not with rebellion this time, with an invitation. A letter was sent, signed by leading figures from both main political groupings, to William of Orange, the Dutch ruler who was married to James's own Protestant daughter Mary. "Come to England," the letter said. "Bring your army, we will support you." William came. In November 1688, he landed in the south of England. As he marched north, James's support evaporated. His army did not fight. His own daughter had sided with the invader. James tried to flee and was caught, but William allowed him to escape to France. The glorious revolution, glorious because bloodless, because it was arranged rather than fought, was complete. William and Mary were offered the throne jointly, but only after accepting a formal statement of parliamentary rights. The Bill of Rights of 1689 established in law what had previously been argued for over decades: Parliament's control over taxation, parliamentary freedom of speech, regular elections, no standing army in peacetime without parliamentary consent. The settlement of 1689 was not a constitution in the formal sense. England would never write a formal constitution. Its legal and political framework would remain unwritten, a living tradition built from statute, precedent, convention, and custom. Flexible and sometimes frustratingly unclear, but enduring. What had been fought over for a century was settled, not perfectly, not finally, but well enough to build on. England had found a form. The story of England's empire is long and complicated, and morally uncomfortable in many ways. We will not look away from that complexity tonight, but we will move through it gently, as we have moved through everything else. England's presence in the wider world began modestly. In the 16th century, English sailors and explorers ventured beyond the familiar waters of European trade. John Cabot, sailing for Henry VII, explored the coast of North America. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe under Elizabeth. The East India Company began establishing trading posts in South and Southeast Asia. The first permanent English settlement in North America was Jamestown, established in Virginia in 1607. It merely failed. The early settlers faced disease and hunger and conflict with the people already living on that land. But they survived, and tobacco cultivation, introduced a few years later, made the colony economically viable. In 1620, a group of religious dissenters, people who felt the Church of England had not gone far enough in its reformation, boarded a ship called the Mayflower and sailed to a cold, unfamiliar coast. They established a colony at Plymouth in what would become Massachusetts. They called themselves Pilgrims, and their story became one of the founding myths of what would eventually become the United States of America. Over the following decades, tens of thousands of English people crossed the Atlantic. They came for many reasons: religious freedom, economic opportunity, escape from debt or poverty or legal trouble. The promise of land, that most precious thing in England, always scarce, always controlled by others. In the Americas, land was not scarce. Or rather, it was not scarce for the newcomers, who did not recognize the ownership claims of the people already living there. This is the deep moral complexity at the heart of colonization. The wealth and freedom that the colonies offered to English settlers came at a cost that was borne by others, by the indigenous peoples of North America, displaced, killed, dispossessed, and by the enslaved Africans who were brought across the ocean by force to labour on the plantations of the Caribbean and the southern colonies. England became one of the major participants in the Atlantic slave trade in the 17th and 18th centuries. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Millions of human beings taken from their homes in West Africa, transported across the ocean in conditions of horror, and put to work on sugar and tobacco and cotton plantations. The wealth they generated flowed back to England, into the counting houses of Bristol and Liverpool and London, into the stately homes of the countryside, into the banks and commercial houses that were making England the commercial centre of the world. The people of England, by and large, did not see the system clearly. The suffering was distant, hidden, invisible. What arrived in England was sugar in their tea, tobacco in their pipes, cotton in their clothes. The connection between those pleasures and the misery that produced them was not something most people thought about. When they were finally forced to think about it, by the abolition movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, by the moral campaigning of people like William Wilberforce and Olaudah Equiano, the reaction was strong. England abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself throughout the British Empire in 1833. The Royal Navy spent decades afterward intercepting slave ships and freeing their captives. It was a genuine moral change. But it came late, and it came after the wealth of the empire had already been built on a foundation that should trouble all of us. We are moving through the 18th century now. England was changing at a pace that no previous generation had experienced. In the countryside, the agricultural revolution, improved tools, new crop rotations, better breeding of livestock, was producing food surpluses that freed people from the land. In the cities and towns, a commercial revolution was creating new forms of wealth based on trade and manufacturing. And in 1769, a Scottish engineer named James Watt made improvements to the steam engine that would change the world. The steam engine was not new, but Watt's improvements made it efficient, reliable, and adaptable. You could use steam to pump water from mines, to drive textile machinery, eventually to power ships and locomotives. One energy source, coal, burned to boil water, to create steam, to drive a piston, could do the work of hundreds of human hands. England had coal in abundance. It had rivers and harbours suited to trade. It had capital, money accumulated through trade and finance that could be invested in expensive machinery. It had a government that largely left private enterprise alone to innovate and compete. And it had people, a growing population, displaced from the countryside and moving the working part of the continent national, was not the first prophet. It had too many factories of pride, a quiet statement or worker, secretary expert, displaced second people. It was thousands of events happening simultaneously, driven by thousands of individuals, each solving their own particular problem. How to spin cotton faster, how to weave it more efficiently, how to smelt iron more cheaply, how to move goods from the factory to the market without the roads turning to mud. The railways changed everything. By the 1840s, a network of railways was being built across England at extraordinary speed. Towns that had taken days to reach were suddenly hours away. Goods that had been expensive to move were now cheap to ship. The country shrank. People began to move not just to the nearest city, but to wherever there was work. The cities grew beyond anything anyone had planned for. London, already the largest city in Europe, expanded until its streets seemed to go on forever. Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds and Sheffield grew from market towns into industrial metropolises within a generation. Mills and factories and workshops and warehouses spread across the northern landscape. The sky above them was perpetually grey with smoke. The lives of the people who worked in those mills and mines were hard. The hours were long. The conditions were often dangerous. Children worked alongside adults. The cities were crowded and dirty and prone to outbreaks of disease. The reformers and novelists who documented this world, Charles Dickens most famously, found material that seemed almost too dark to be believed. And yet, people came. They came because, for all the hardship, the cities offered something. A wage that was actually a wage, not just food and a place to sleep. The possibility of advancement, the stimulation of a world in motion. The Industrial Revolution made England the most powerful economy in the world by the middle of the 19th century. It also created the conditions for everything that would come next. A working class that could organise, demand rights, change the political landscape. The old order, based on land and birth and traditional hierarchy, was already starting to shift. Victoria came to the throne in 1837 at the age of 18, and she would reign for 63 years. Her reign coincided with England's, Britain's greatest period of power. Chew, brass, and fire. The empire, built over centuries through trade and conquest and settlement, reached its maximum extent in the late 19th century. It included India, vast swaths of Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and hundreds of smaller territories scattered across every ocean. The British Empire, at its peak, governed roughly a quarter of the world's land and population. This was maintained not through the constant presence of British troops everywhere. There were never enough British troops for that, but through a combination of naval supremacy, economic leverage, local alliances, and the administrative structures the British built in each territory they controlled. The Royal Navy was the key. It dominated the world's seas in a way that no other power could challenge. Trade routes were protected, colonies were supplied, and any challenge to British commercial or strategic interests could be met with a warship. The British justified their empire to themselves in various ways. They were bringing civilization, they said, spreading Christianity, ending the slave trade, even as the wealth accumulated from that trade sustained the empire, bringing modern medicine, modern law, modern technology to peoples who had not yet discovered them. The people on the receiving end of empire often had different views. In India, where the East India Company's trading posts had gradually grown into territorial control, the violence and exploitation of imperial rule was clear to those who lived under it. The Indian Uprising of 1857, still debated by historians, known as the Mutiny by the British and the First War of Independence by many Indians, was a massive and widespread rejection of British rule that was put down with great violence. In Africa, the scramble of the late 19th century, when European powers divided the continent among themselves at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 without consulting a single African ruler, imposed new borders and new rulers on peoples who had not chosen them. The empire was real, and its effects on the world were profound and lasting. Some of those effects were genuinely beneficial: infrastructure, medicine, legal institutions that endured after independence. Some were deeply harmful: the disruption of existing societies, the extraction of resources, the imposition of cultural norms that belittled everything that came before. History does not allow us easy judgments. It asks us to hold complexity, to recognize that the same institution can create real benefits and real harm, sometimes simultaneously. What we can say with certainty is that the British Empire shaped the world. The English language, spoken by more people as a second or additional language than any other on earth, is part of that legacy. The institutions of many independent nations, their legal systems, their parliamentary structures, their universities, bear the marks of the British period. The world map, still largely drawn with lines set in the colonial era, is part of that legacy, and Britain itself was shaped by empire. The food on British tables, tea, sugar, spices, tropical fruits, the people in British streets, as immigrants from former colonies brought their languages, their religions, their cultures to the imperial centre. The very idea of what it meant to be British was formed in relationship to the empire, and it continues to be renegotiated. Two great wars passed through England in the 20th century like storms. The First World War, which England entered in August 1914, honouring treaty obligations and responding to German aggression, lasted 4 years. 6 million British and Empire soldiers served. Nearly 1 million British died. The Western Front, where most of them fought, was a place of mud and wire and horror that had no precedent in any previous war. The Battle of the Somme in July 1916 saw nearly 60,000 British casualties on its first day alone. The men who went to the Western Front were not mostly professional soldiers. They were volunteers and then conscripts, farmers and factory workers and teachers and shop assistants, people with no military background who found themselves in the most industrialised killing ground the world had ever produced. Many of them wrote about it. Their poetry and memoirs are among the most powerful ever written in English. The war ended in November 1918. England had won, but the cost was almost incomprehensible. The country was poorer, its best generation diminished, its confidence in old certainty shaken. And then, 21 years later, it had to do it again. The Second World War, which began in 1939 when England honoured its commitment to Poland against German invasion, was in some ways an even more profound experience. Because this time, for a period in 1940 and 1941, England stood effectively alone. France had fallen. The United States had not yet entered the war. The British Empire was stretched thin. And Germany, with its extraordinary military machine, its modern air force, its industrialised war economy, was attempting to destroy the Royal Air Force as a prelude to invasion. The Battle of Britain was fought in the skies over southern England through the summer and autumn of 1940. A small number of RAF pilots, many of them very young, many of them from countries other than Britain, flew sortie after sortie against the numerically superior enemy. The margins were very thin. On some days, it seemed impossible that they could hold. They held. And Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, who had been warning about Hitler for years before anyone listened, gave England the words it needed. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The German bombing of British cities, the Blitz, followed. Night after night through the autumn and winter of 1940 and into 1941, bombs fell on London, on Liverpool, on Birmingham, on Coventry, on ports and industrial centres across the country. Thousands of civilians were killed. Entire neighbourhoods were destroyed. And yet, life continued. Businesses opened, schools operated, buses ran when they could. People slept in underground stations and emerged in the morning to go to work. The Blitz spirit, that determined, sometimes darkly humorous refusal to be broken, became a defining image of what England believed itself to be at its best. The war ended in 1945 with victory, but England emerged from it a different country. Poorer, diminished in power relative to the United States and the Soviet Union, its empire visibly beginning to dissolve. But also, in some ways, more equal and more humane than it had ever been, shaped by the shared experience of total war into something that demanded a fairer distribution of its burdens and its benefits, In 1948, the National Health Service was created, a system providing healthcare free at the point of use to every person in Britain, regardless of her means. It was, and remains, one of the most popular and most significant things England has ever built. In the decades after the war, England let go of its empire, not always gracefully, not always peacefully. In some places, Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus, the end of empire came with violence and injustice that is still being reckoned with. But compared to what might have been, the decolonization process was relatively swift. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947. Most of Africa followed in the 1950s and 1960s, the Caribbean islands in the 1960s and 1970s. England had been for 3 centuries the centre of the world's largest empire. Now it had to find a different way of being in the world. It joined what became the European Union, though always awkwardly, always with reservations, always with a sense of being the odd one out in a club whose rules it had not written. It remained close to the United States, sharing language, culture, legal tradition, and strategic interests in a relationship that sometimes felt genuinely equal and sometimes felt like something else. It received in the post-war decades waves of immigrants from its former empire, from the Caribbean, from South Asia, from East Africa. These new communities transformed the culture of England's cities. Their food, their music, their religions, their languages became part of the texture of English life. England became, more visibly than ever before, a multicultural society, a process that brought enormous richness and real challenges. The 1960s, the public social forces, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the British invasion of American popular music, the social upheavals of the counterculture, and that first half brought a real sensitive problem. England, which had seemed after the war like a serious, grey, austerity-bound place, suddenly seemed glamorous and creative and young. The 1970s brought economic crisis and labour unrest. The 1980s brought Margaret Thatcher, a divisive, consequential Prime Minister. He reshaped the economy, broke the power of the trade unions, and remains a figure of fierce argument decades after her death. The 1990s brought Tony Blair's New Labour, a modernised left-of-centre government that oversaw relative prosperity and oversaw the devolution of power to Scotland and Wales, giving those nations their own assemblies for the first time. And then, the 2010s. The 2010s. Brexit, the vote in 2016 to leave the European Union, a decision that split the country almost exactly in half and that has defined British politics and national identity ever since. Arguments about sovereignty and immigration and what England is for in the 21st century. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, after 70 years on the throne, the longest reign in British history, felt like the end of something. Not just a monarch, but a way of being, a continuity, a familiarity, a link to a world that had already passed. Her son Charles III took the throne. The world continued. England is still there. That small, green, fog-wrapped island on the western edge of Europe. Its fields still roll gently under wide skies. Its ancient cities still carry their centuries in the shape of their streets, in the names of their neighbourhoods, in the stones of their cathedrals. Stonehenge still stands on its plain. Hadrian's Wall still crosses the north. Alfred's laws, Magna Carta's principles, Shakespeare's words, all of it still present. still alive, still resonating. What makes England remarkable is not that it was always good or always great. It was neither. Its history contains extraordinary courage and creativity, but also terrible violence, exploitation, and injustice. An honest account has to hold all of it. What makes it remarkable is that it endured and changed and endured again. From the first wanderers who crossed the marshy plain of Doggerland, following the animals and the seasons, to the people who live there today, working, arguing, eating and drinking, loving and mourning. Watching the news and wondering what comes next, England has always been a place of becoming, not a fixed thing, a process, a conversation across centuries. Tonight, you have travelled through 30,000 years of that conversation. You began at the beginning, ice and stone, and the first footprints in the soil of an unknown island. You drifted through the Bronze Age, through the Druids and the hill forts and the tin mines that connected Britain to the ancient world. You watched Rome arrive and reshape everything, and then watched it leave, and watched what grew in the silence it left behind. The 1990s brought Tony Blair's New Labour, a modernised left-of-centre government that oversaw relative prosperity and oversaw the devolution of power to Scotland and Wales, giving those nations their own assemblies for the first time. And then, the 2010s. The 2010s, Brexit, the vote in 2016 to leave the European Union, a decision that split the country almost exactly in half and that has defined British politics and national identity ever since. Arguments about sovereignty and immigration and what England is for in the 21st century. The death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, after 70 years on the throne, the longest reign in British history, felt like the end of something. Not just a monarch, but a way of being, a continuity, a familiarity, a link to a world that had already passed. Her son Charles III took the throne. The world continued. England is still there. That small, green, fog-wrapped island on the western edge of Europe. Its fields still roll gently under wide skies. Its ancient cities still carry their centuries in the shape of their streets, in the names of their neighbourhoods, in the stones of their cathedrals. Stonehenge still stands on its plain. Hadrian's Wall still crosses the north. Alfred's laws, Magna Carta's principles, Shakespeare's words, all of it still present, still alive, still resonating. What makes England remarkable is not that it was always good or always great. It was neither. Its history contains extraordinary courage and creativity, but also terrible violence, exploitation, and injustice. An honest account has to hold all of it. What makes it remarkable is that it endured and changed and endured again. From the first wanderers who crossed the marshy plain of Doggerland, following the animals and the seasons, to the people who live there today, working, arguing, eating and drinking, loving and mourning, watching the news and wondering what comes next. England has always been a place of becoming, not a fixed thing. A process, a conversation across centuries. Tonight, you have travelled through 30,000 years of that conversation. You began at the beginning, ice and stone and the first footprints in the soil of an unknown island. You drifted through the Bronze Age, through the Druids and the hill forts and the tin mines that connected Britain to the ancient world. You watched Rome arrive and reshape everything, and then watched it leave, and watched what grew in the silence it left behind. You heard the longships of the Vikings and the soft beginnings of the English language. You walked with Alfred in the marshes of Somerset and stood at Hastings on a grey October day. You sat in the medieval halls where barons argued and monarchs calculated, and ordinary farmers went to bed exhausted by the same long day their grandparents had lived. You watched Henry VIII break the world apart and Elizabeth I put it back together. You felt the fear of the Civil War and the strange relief of the Restoration. You saw the mills rise and the cities grow, and the empire spread across the map of the world, trailing complexity and consequence behind it. You held the terrible weight of the world wars and the quiet dignity of what came after. And now you are here, at the end of the story that has never quite finished. The island still changing, the conversation still going on. Let it go now. Let all of it drift away gently, like fog lifting from the morning fields. You have travelled far tonight. Now it is time to rest. Breathe in slowly and breathe out. The island is still there. The world continues its long turning, and you can sleep